now that a former Trump campaign advisor has pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI in the so-called Russiagate affair, what political fallout for the president might there be as new revelations unfold? And after Japan's Shinzo Abe hosted talks with the Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte on Monday, I'll be asking what Japan hopes to gain from cozying up to its southern neighbor with new promises of aid to this impoverished country. Welcome to The Point. Live from Beijing, I'm Li Xin. On Monday, George Papadopoulos, a former Donald Trump campaign advisor, pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI about the timing of meetings with alleged go-betweens with Russia. Separately, former Trump campaign manager Paul Manafort pleaded not guilty to 12 charges, including conspiracy against the U.S., money laundering, and failure to file reports of foreign bank and financial accounts from as early as 2006 to the beginning of this year. These are the latest developments after a Washington, D.C. federal grand jury approved a set of initial charges stemming from the investigation into Russia's alleged meddling in the U.S. presidential race last year. So what do these developments mean for the investigation? Joining me today is Rick Dunham, visiting scholar at Tsinghua University. Rick, welcome back to the studio. Now tell us a bit about the significance of these latest developments. What do they mean?
Well, the most significant part was George Papadopoulos, because he was a foreign policy advisor to Donald Trump, but his name had not come up in the leaks that were there out of the special prosecutor's office, and he has agreed to cooperate. This is the key, and the evidence that the special prosecutor released, I think, was meant to send a message to other potential conspirators in the rigging of the election, particularly because the timeline is starting to become clear. The hack of Hillary Clinton's emails, and then you have Papadopoulos saying that that Putin wants to set up a meeting with Donald Trump, and then he's saying in email that they want to do a cutout, meaning that it would not be Donald Trump going, but it would be a lower level person like him or another staffer who would go. The timeline is starting to emerge from the beginning of the hack to the release of them in July, and if you match up Donald Trump's statements to the timeline that the special prosecutor has started to unveil, it's looking grim for the president. He says that it has nothing to do with him, nothing to do with the White House. My view is that he has somebody who's turned on the president, and now he's trying to get Manafort, Paul Manafort, who was the campaign chairman, to turn on him. He filed, it's basically money laundering charges. It sounds very serious, conspiracy against the United States. It basically was that he conspired to hide money that he was getting from Ukraine, from Putin ally political people in the Ukraine. And so it's a very interesting situation. It's unfolding the way organized crime trials unfold in the United States, not political cases.
Wow. You said before the show that you were staying up late last night to listen to the press conference, and tell us a bit more about what you heard. For instance, what could the potential damage be to the U.S. leader? Although you said it doesn't seem to be, at this stage, it's still evasive, however, and the White House spokeswoman Sarah Sanders said the role of Papadopoulos in the Trump campaign had been extremely limited, and that he had been in a volunteer position, she said, and that no activity was done in any official capacity. However, can this case really affect Trump in the future? Okay,
the answer is you have stated some of the important things that Sarah Sanders said. The main thing she said is this has nothing to do with the president. That first, the president was not named at all in the indictment of Manafort and Rick Gates, the Manafort associate. He was named in the Papadopoulos documents, but they're saying this had nothing to do with the White House, had to do with the campaign. He was a minor, small-level person. That might have been, but after he started to cooperate, he continued to have conversations with people in the Trump orbit, and the speculation is that he had been wired by the FBI, that he was being recorded. So anyone who's had a conversation with him has to be worried about what they said, because the FBI and the prosecutor may know what it is.
So this could only be the beginning of many more revelations to come. Now let's cross live by telephone to Moscow to Dmitry Babic, a political analyst at Sputnik International. Hello, Mr. Babic. Thank you for joining us. I guess some people might be watching this very closely in Russia. What do you make of these latest developments that are making headlines in the United States?
Well, there is a certain fatigue in Russia. People are simply tired of following this investigation, which has been going on for more than a year. I mean, the first allegations against Russia started back at the time of the electoral campaign. And now, okay, we have at least one first case of a real indictment, 2 people placed under house arrest. But all the charges are not connected directly to Russia. They are connected to Paul Manafort's activities in Ukraine between 2007 and 2014, well, when Manafort helped the Ukrainian president Viktor Yanukovych, first a candidate and then a president, to get elected. Well, Mr. Yanukovych headed a different country. He headed Ukraine. It was an independent country. Russia vied for influence over Ukraine with the European Union. So if Mr. Yanukovych had been a puppet, as the Western mainstream media claims now, there would be no fight between Russia and the European Union for influence over him. Paul Manafort, I mean, I don't approve of his activities in Ukraine, but we had hundreds of such American political consultants working in Russia with Mr. Yeltsin in the 90s, and none of them was declared a criminal. None of them was indicted or charged with conspiracy against the United States. So the whole affair appears to be politically motivated, and that was said very clearly today by the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, who said that if after a year of investigation they could not produce anything more substantial, then obviously Russia is clean, because otherwise they would have come out with something more serious than just Paul Manafort's misdeeds in Ukraine.
Yeah, well, how credible do you find the charges that have been stipulated in the indictment papers? I mean, there are Russian news reports that say they have studied these indictments and found apparent flaws, which prove that some of these charges are really just made up. What is your take on that?
Well, the charges are very weak, and I think if there is a real trial, a fair trial, the case will simply collapse in the court. Because, I mean, all these allegations of Russian influence through Facebook or Twitter just reported that these so-called Russian messages, they made up about 0.75% of all the messages issued over the presidential campaign in the United States. So it was a very small share of messages. And second, if you remember the campaign, Mr. Obama, who was supposed to be neutral during the election, he interfered a lot more than Russians, and he did it quite openly. Just remember how he called one of the candidates, Mr. Trump, a threat to humanity. Remember how Obama promised the G7 members that Trump would never become the president of the United States. That was clearly outside of Mr. Obama's powers. As a president, he was supposed to be neutral. So a lot of people voted out of protest.
Yeah.
You know, they were not so much voting for Trump, they were voting against Obama and Clinton. But the problem is that the American establishment is not ready to accept this, is not ready to recognize this.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Dmitry Babic, political analyst with Sputnik International. Rika, you have been nodding your head. Which part of the answer of Mr. Babic you do not agree with?
I think the political part at the end was really naive. Barack Obama at Election Day was about 60% favorable. People were voting against Hillary Clinton. They were not voting against Barack Obama. And every president of the same party has supported that party's nominee. Going back, if you look, 1960 with Dwight Eisenhower, Richard Nixon, 1968 Lyndon Johnson, Ronald Reagan with George Bush. That's the normal part. The other thing that I think is important to realize is we don't know all of the evidence. this is a strategic move to indict Manafort just on those charges, because what can happen, because he used organized crime type charges, he can seize the assets of Manafort, his homes, his property, and that's an attempt to flip him, to get him to turn and give information he has. Yes, there is not a lot of evidence out there about Russia in these indictments, but this is not the last step. This is the first small steps.
Still, how do you look at the impact of these developments so far already on the relationship between Russia and the United States?
Right.
I mean, these two countries have a very important roles to play.
It's hard. Yeah, it is hard. And Donald Trump, I agree in the big picture. Donald Trump wants to improve the relations between the United States and Russia, and I think that's a good idea. They can't get much worse than they were at the end of the Obama presidency. But he's held back because of these charges. I mean, he's been ineffective as a president with legislation. The main legislation he had to sign was the congressional sanctions against Russia, and those tightened sanctions. That was not what he was in favor of at all. So this hamstrings him. It makes it very difficult for him to try to become closer to Russia, to repair the relationship.
Yeah, now there's more countries, more Russian defense and intelligence entities listed on the sanctions list. But this list has been, was supposed to be released on October the 1st, but it only came out at the end of October. What was the delay? Very quickly.
I think he was slow walking it. He didn't want to do it, but he was required by the law to do it. So he used all of the time he had. He is given some time, and he took advantage of that to just do it more slowly, try to work with the Russians, I think, as much as possible.
Okay, we have to leave it there. Many thanks, Rick Dunham from Tsinghua University. And, well, my first point here is more on the international scale. It is too early to tell what will come out of the so-called Russiagate investigation. But what can be said is, at this stage, American relations with Russia have been pushed to a new low. Now, in many parts of the world, U.S.-Russia interaction could be a necessary force for good, as was shown in the negotiations on the Iran nuclear deal or the agreement to take care of Syria's chemical weapons. Being the biggest geopolitical powers in the world, the two countries can use some minimum levels of mutual trust. However, under the current political climate in the U.S., that possibility is close to zero. Now, the Cold War ended more than 2 decades ago, but the anti-Russia fighters, conservative think tanks, military-industrial complex, and financial interest groups will not allow their interests to be heard, even at the cost of America's national interest. My take. And you've been watching The Point with me, Liu Xin. We'll take a short break and we'll be back right after that. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe hosted talks with Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte in Tokyo on Monday. The two leaders described two-way relations as entering a golden age of strategic partnership as they continue to deepen cooperation on infrastructure and counter-terrorism. In a joint statement, Abe promised that Japan would support the Philippines in the reconstruction of the strife-torn southern city of Marawi. He also reaffirmed that the government of Japan and the private sector would extend economic cooperation worth 1 trillion yen, or some $9 billion over the next 5 years to help Duterte's initiatives to revamp infrastructure, including building subways in Manila and improving rivers in Davao, where Duterte served as mayor for a couple of years. The two leaders also talked about maritime safety and free navigation in the South China Sea as Japan vows to help the Philippines strengthen its maritime capacities. Some are saying Japan is trying to counter China's regional influence with its yen diplomacy. What do the two leaders want to take away from the deepened ties, and what implications will these ties have on other countries in the region? Joining me from Singapore is Lim Tai Wei, a research fellow at the East Asian Institute of the National University of Singapore, and Dr. Victor Teo from Boston, an assistant professor in the Department of Japanese Studies at the University of Hong Kong. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Mr. Lim, Abe promised economic cooperation worth some $9 billion over the next 5 years. Papadopoulos. Meanwhile, China last year also pledged to extend economic assistance to Manila worth some $24 billion. It gives people the impression that Japan is trying to raise with Beijing. What is your take?
I think if you look at the report that was given by Asian Development Bank and also the multilateral institution of AIB, there is a commonality between the narrative coming from both institutions, which is enough funding for infrastructure projects and connectivity in. And so this gives a lot of space for two institutions to provide this kind of funding for Asia. And in this sense, both ADB and AIB, as well as other big, major powers and big economies involved, can play a role in this infrastructure needs of Asia. And in this case, the Philippines is benefiting from both infrastructure funding from Japan as well as from China. With China, President Duterte has turned around a bilateral relationship and has built up a good relationship with Chinese leadership and also tapped into the Belt and Road Initiative. And in this visit by Prime Minister Abe, Shinzo Abe of Japan, the President Duterte has also tapped into his personal friendship with Prime Minister Abe to tap into $8.7 billion worth of infrastructure aid from Japan to be delivered over the next 5 years. So in this sense, President Duterte is yielding and harvesting the rewards from very strategic diplomacy, both political and economic diplomacy with the major powers in this region.
Mm-hmm.
And as for
Dr. Tell,
and Japan,
we'll come back to you, Mr. Lim. We'll come back to you, Mr. Lim. Dr. Till, I would like to know your take on the Japanese government's strategy in Asia and in Africa in terms of economic assistance. Do you see a conflict with China's foreign aid programs in these areas?
I don't think there is a conflict per se, but I can certainly speak to the fact that there will be some sort of there is a competitive element in the sense that both countries are actually trying their very best to reach out to these areas which are what I call not so traditional areas of their influence. So meaning they are trying to reach out globally beyond their backyard to seek more influence in Africa, in the Middle East, in Latin America. So to that extent, what the Japanese Prime Minister is doing in Philippines is actually not so different from what Japan has done before. Japan has actually given a lot of aid to various countries in the world. But the Philippines is really important for Japan in a sense that it's one of the principal allies of the U.S. alliance system in Asia. And to that extent, because the new Philippines president has actually chose to exercise what he calls a more independent foreign policy. And I think this is actually a very good move by the Philippine president. Japan is actually very keen to ensure that the Philippines, no matter what it does with China, does not move completely into the Chinese orbit. And to that extent, I think the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has worked very hard. He was one of the first, well, actually, if I'm not wrong, he's the first state leader to call on the Philippine President Duterte when he became the president. He developed a personal rapport with the president. And the timing of this visit is interesting because this is actually one year anniversary. Last year around October this time, after the China's visit, the Philippine president actually went to Japan and where he met the Japanese Prime Minister, and they have a very good working relationship. And this visit comes after Prime Minister Abe's election win, and it also comes before President Trump's Asia visit. So I think there is a lot of things that is going on.
Yeah, we're going to talk about.
There are subtle messages.
We're going to talk about these important messages in just a moment. But I would like to know a bit more about your thoughts on the South China Sea issue that's been in the picture here. Now, he has been trying hard to have been trying hard to win Duterte over in dealing with territorial disputes in the South China Sea. And this time, during Duterte's visit, Japan pledged to help the Philippines in human resources development, in capacity building, and in providing petrol vessels and other equipment for the Philippines Coast Guards. But tensions in the waters in the South China Sea have actually been eased right since Duterte came into office. So what do you look at? How do you look at the implications of these measures in the future? Should China be concerned by this kind of cooperation between Japan and the Philippines?
Well, no, because I think the Chinese appreciate what the Philippine president has done, given that the International Court of Arbitration actually ruled in Philippines' favor sometime in July 2016, and this president 6 months after actually went to the Chinese and turned around Philippines' foreign policy. This is a remarkable turn of events. I think it's a good development for China-Philippines relationship. The Japanese moves are more, I think, self-serving in that sense, because Japanese have an interest in checking what they perceive to be Chinese expansionism in Southeast Asia in general. So Philippines and Vietnam and Myanmar are actually important regions which the Japanese have focused their efforts. But to the extent whether the Japanese can actually leverage upon their influence and turn these Southeast Asian countries against China remains to be seen. I personally suspect that the Southeast Asian countries have they all have a mind of their own. They will probably take from both the Chinese and the Japanese, but they will remain, I suspect, very friendly towards both nations.
Mr. Lim,
I'm talking about Japan and China here.
Yeah, Mr. Lim, let's talk a little bit about the perception of common Filipino people towards Japan and relations with Japan. Now, during this visit, Duterte praised Japan as a true friend of the Philippines. How do the common Filipinos view this relationship, given that Japan occupied the Philippines from 1942 to 1945?
I think if you look at the Filipino media reports, you can find that the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, he has actually a Facebook account. And in the Facebook account, he has actually put images as well as videos of his visit to the Philippines in the last trip. And it was the first trip by a foreign leader to the Philippines. And Prime Minister Shinzo Abe actually said that the number of hits on the social media was actually the highest ever on his Facebook account. And 90% of those hits actually came from the common Filipino people. So it seems like there's a lot of tremendous interest in the common Filipino folks in the bilateral relations between Japan and the Philippines. And in the last visit as well, many people from the Philippines were also noticing the fact that President Duterte actually served some of his simple and also delicious meals to the Japanese Prime Minister. In this sense, in terms of people-to-people diplomacy, in terms of perceptions by the common folks, it seems like it's a very positive development, because President Duterte himself has created an image where he has links with the working class, with the common folks, and that he's down to earth with the people in his province, as well as other working class people within the Philippines. So there's a root, there's a kind of a connection that he has with the common people, and it seems like this contact with the Japanese Prime Minister has sort of provided a conduit for that kind of diplomacy.
Yeah, Dr. Thier.
So in this sense, judging from social media.
Yeah, I got your point, Mr. Lim. Dr. Thier, let me come to the special significance you mentioned about the timing of the visit. We know that U.S. President Donald Trump will be visiting Manila just in a couple of days' time. What does that lend additional significance to Duterte's visit to Japan this time?
I think it's interesting because the Filipino president, well, judging from the narratives that has been coming out of Tokyo, the Philippine president has been very supportive of Prime Minister Abe's domestic agenda. He talks about support for Japan's North Korea positions and issues, and he did say that someone should actually talk to North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-un. And I think when he says someone, he's not actually saying who, but I think he's actually hinting that it could be. I think this is a message for the Americans, because the Chinese have made it abundantly clear that from their perspective, it is something that the North Koreans should talk directly with the Americans. And I think from a Japanese perspective, they probably think the same, but they're too polite to say this to the Americans, and also because the Americans are the principal allies. So here we have the Philippines leader making this statement, which is pretty interesting. I think because the way the Philippine presidential election system works, this is a one-term president. Philippine presidents cannot go up for re-election. So whatever this Philippines president does is actually, I think, for the good of in his mind, for the good of his country. So he wants to have a very solid alibi of solid working relationship with the Japanese Prime Minister, who is, in theory, supposed to be able to reign till 2021.
That
and,
also,
the Philippines president will be 2022.
Yeah, that maybe explains his pragmatism to get the most out of every relationship the Filipino country can have at this moment. Many thanks, Dr. Victor Teo from the Department of Japanese Studies at the University of Hong Kong, and many thanks to Lim Tai Wei at the East Asian Institute of the National University of Singapore. And my last point here, now some Japanese media have pointed out that Abe's engagement with the Philippines is to counter China. Well, China has been calling for the building of a community of common destiny for all mankind, and countries need to abandon the outdated zero-sum mentality of the Cold War era. If Japan and the Philippines both need each other and come closer, it is not for China to be concerned or jealous. That said, such a relationship will only be sustainable and conducive if it is not targeting China or any other third country. That is why, being the pragmatic leader he is, it is wise for Filipino President Duterte to reject Japan's offer of missiles, saying that a third world war would only destroy the world. That is it for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. Before I go, let me tell you how you can get your stories, comments and videos aired on our program. We will launch a special show on World Poverty Reduction in mid-November, and we'll need your input. When you hear the word poverty, what comes to your mind? If you have a question to ask, a comment to make, or a story to tell, send them to me via The Point with Alex@cgtn.com, or share it on your Facebook or Twitter account using hashtag #PovertyAndUs, and tag me at The Point with Alex. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.